also pull up your didactic and just advance your slides for you if you'd like.
That'd be great if that's no trouble.
Oh, no trouble at all. All right. Everyone able to see that okay?
I cannot.
No, it looks, yeah, not.
Let's see. Is that better?
Yep.
Much better. There
Awesome.
we go.
Thanks, guys.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back. I'm very relieved to see that there are some very smart people that I work with that are known to me participating. So I have the right to defer any challenging questions to those participants. So it's great to be with everyone. What I want to talk about today is vaccine hesitancy in the context of the new COVID vaccines. Next slide, please. And first of all, as you know, unless you've been living under a rock, we are at the focus of not only a national but an international limelight in a very positive way for our early success in administering this vaccine. We'll talk a little bit about that and perhaps try and address the question as to why that is. Then step back perhaps a little bit and think about the problem that we have with vaccine hesitancy more broadly. This is something I've thought about for years. And when you think about it, you don't see the same issues with other areas of medicine. For example, I'm not aware of large numbers of people being concerned about taking Lipitor and cholesterol lowering medications, that this might be a collusion with pharmaceutical industries and that they might cause problems with dementia or other adverse outcomes. Nor do I hear people saying you shouldn't get a screening colonoscopy because a chip might be implanted in your colon, et cetera. There's something about vaccines in particular. And so we're going to talk about perhaps why that is and how, once we are understanding and sensitive to that, how that might inform our approach to overcome vaccine hesitancy, which will be the third part in terms of effectively communicating about vaccines. Because I look around and I don't see us necessarily communicating effectively, or at least as effectively as we could. And then finally, think about the goals of vaccination. That might seem self-evident, but as a public health practitioner, I'm always thinking about the population level. And I hope to clarify some of our goals of vaccination and in fact argue that there are going to be two related goals of any vaccination campaign. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're in the unaccustomed position of getting a lot of positive public attention. This is just a screenshot from a recent New York Times article, but I don't think there's been a major news outlet that has not, to some extent, covered our success. And I have been interviewed by more media in the last couple of weeks than in my entire rest of my career. And the question that typically comes up is, why West Virginia? It almost as if it would be not possible for us to succeed at anything. People are so accustomed to a steady stream of negative news about us, particularly in public health, not entirely without reason, but people are surprised and did not expect us to be leading the nation. Next slide, please. I got caught up in this and wrote a piece in The Atlantic. It seems unreal that The Atlantic would accept something that I would write, but nonetheless, this was a piece that came out early last month. There is an interesting local story to this. The editor of this section of The Atlantic, the ideas section, actually grew up in Morgantown, and so is personally committed to drawing the good press to our state. So that may have played a role in this. And what I'm really going to try and do is kind of embellish this and provide more technical information from what I wrote in The Atlantic. Next slide. So why West Virginia? I think we need to be obvious that our small population played a role in this. When you look at the states that are leading, the states with smaller populations are leading, Alaska being another one. So there's certainly a logistical element. If the wedding reception has 50 guests versus 5,000, everyone's going to get their correct order and hot food in a much more prompt manner than with much larger sizes. So there's no question that when you're small, you can be nimble, and that's certainly a factor. But I think there was something else to this related, but nonetheless another facet to this that I tried to draw attention to. As you're aware, the federal plan unveiled last fall called for long-term care facilities to receive the vaccines through a partnership with the chain pharmacies of CVS and Walgreens. Our state chose not to follow that model at that time, and chose instead to partner with our community-based pharmacies. Unusually, we still have a lot of those community-based pharmacies, about 250 versus 150 of the CVS and Walgreens. Not only is there a discrepancy in the number, there's also a distribution factor. You're far more likely to have a family-owned community-based pharmacy in a rural part of our state, which is most of our state. So these community-based pharmacies are not only better represented, but they're more evenly represented throughout our state. By the end of January, everyone who both lived in and worked at one of these facilities who chose to be vaccinated had received both doses by the end of January. I was saying earlier, all of my family are in Canada, and to give you an N of 1 comparison, my 91-year-old mother received her first dose in Ottawa last week. So to give you some idea of how far Canada is behind. And as I indicated, most of the other states in our country are also well behind this pace. And at the same time, the number of COVID outbreaks in those facilities fell by 50%. And we'll talk more about this role of the vaccines in transmission. Next slide, please. So stepping back a little bit, why do we have this problem with vaccines? Again, I don't hear this about Lipitor or colonoscopies or other widely used medical interventions. What is it about vaccines? And this is something I've been thinking about for years and years and years. This is material that I used to teach the first-year medical students, and I always struggle to understand what is it about vaccines that creates this hesitancy. Next slide, please. As my former medical students know, and they usually roll their eyes, because one thing I discovered, medical students absolutely hate history. So I would always get course feedback, please ditch the history. We don't want to learn any history. We just want to learn the stuff of today. And of course, the problem with that perspective is they don't realize yet how much we can learn from history, and how everything that we know now is very tentative and is going to change throughout their careers. Nevertheless, I love history, and I came across this letter published in 1887 by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is far better known for writing the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. Someone in the chat says I was a history major. Great. Well, this presentation is targeted for the history majors. What a lot of people don't realize, however, about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is he was also a physician. He graduated from the University of Edinburgh's very fine and very well-known medical school. As somewhat of an aside, he actually modeled the character of Sherlock Holmes after a master clinician by the name of Bell that he studied under as a medical student. Seeing that clinical reasoning had such an impact on him that was the model for Sherlock Holmes' character in the mysteries. He was also very strongly supportive of vaccination campaigns. And in this letter that I was reading, what's really interesting is he's commenting here in response to somebody else that was raising concerns about the vaccine that was being used and had been used for decades at that point even, and that was the smallpox vaccination. And he's writing, adverse effects are certainly rare, and he talks about how infrequently he observed adverse health effects. But he writes, some parents have an amusing habit of ascribing anything which happens to their children, from the whooping cough to a broken leg, to the effects of their vaccination. And of course, if you quickly Google, you can find lots of articles about someone collapsing and dying shortly after getting a COVID vaccine, lots of concerns about other adverse effects. So what was striking about this letter was two things. First of all, vaccine hesitancy has been present ever since we've had vaccines. While we think of this as some new phenomenon, it's not. It's always been around. It always will be around. And not only that, its character really hasn't changed a whole lot over the years. Essentially, as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle pointed out in this letter, among two reasons for vaccine hesitancy are concerns about adverse effects based on really chronological or circumstantial evidence, but also vaccine complacency. In this same letter, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle writes that part of the problem with smallpox vaccination was this was now a generation that did not see the visible scars that had affected so many people with smallpox just 100 years earlier. And again, much is the same now. So vaccine hesitancy, not new, it will be forever with us. And its character really hasn't changed in well over 100 years. Next slide, please. Another angle to this that I think helps me understand why vaccine hesitancy is such a public health issue is the work of a fellow by the name of Peter Sandman. I learned about Peter Sandman when I was a resident in the 1990s. He's really considered the father of risk communication. So he's not actually a technical expert, but anybody who works in the area of risk communication, since my master's was in environmental health, this is a huge issue. But he's also spoken and written a lot about vaccine hesitancy and how we communicate about vaccines. I'd strongly encourage you to look at his videos, go to his website and read his writings. In many ways, he's very critical of how we as a public health profession have communicated about vaccines. And I think it's a very important message for all of us to bear in mind. What Peter Sandman described decades ago, or this was not his initial description, but he drew attention to the fact that there's an extremely poor correlation, almost no correlation, between scientific measures of hazards and how people perceive them. As an example, you may be a person, or you certainly know somebody who is afraid of flying. I know a few people like that. I don't, however, know a single person who has a fear of traveling by car. Now, that makes no sense based on the scientific data. We know that particularly in younger groups, one of the leading causes of death is in fact motor vehicle collisions, but you really don't know of anybody who has that fear. And this applies across a whole spectrum of hazards. That scientific measures what the technicians describe as risks does not correlate with how much we fear or worry about them. And this led Sandman to the equation that he jokes put his kids through college, which is that risk, how we perceive the threat of something, is a combination of hazard, which is the technical measure, what the data, what the people on this webinar would think about, the numbers, the incidence, et cetera, those measures, those technical measures, plus another component that he calls outrage. Outrage is subjective, it's emotional. Next slide. When we look at the factors that drive outrage, Sandman points these out as factors that will be powerfully influential on that emotional component that has a very strong role in how we perceive risks, whether or not it's voluntary or involuntary. I remember my professor in the 1990s illustrating this by, suppose you're cutting something with a very sharp knife. You've got one hand on the object and you're cutting it with a knife. It could be a roast of meat or a large vegetable if you're a vegetarian, and it's being cut with a sharp knife. He said, picture in your mind what happens when you hand that sharp knife over to somebody else. Of course, mentally in your mind, you will immediately think about moving your hand further away from the blade because now you're not in control. That person actually might be better at cutting than you are, but it doesn't matter. Now that you're not in control, you perceive the risk to be greater. As you could think about, that would be one of the reasons why we would be less worried about driving by car when we're operating the car than flying by plane when we don't even know who this pilot is, who's operating, and we are completely at their whim. Work done by our Reed College of Media colleagues who've been helping us with communicating about the COVID vaccine have found that this is a major factor in West Virginia. Issues of liberty, is this going to be a mandatory vaccine? I have the right to choose, et cetera, are very powerfully operative in our population. Then you can look at these other factors, whether the risk is natural, familiar, not memorable versus synthetic, artificial, or exotic. And when you add genetic material to this mix, this greatly heightens the outrage factor. When people think that there's some sort of genetic material, the possibility of modification of genetics or my DNA, this creates a heightened factor of outrage. Whether the outcome is memorable, dreaded, chronic, versus not memorable, not dreaded, chronic versus memorable, dreaded, and catastrophic also drive risks. Again, you can see news publications of people collapsing and dying shortly after getting a vaccine, really driving outrage factors. Next slide, please. So it occurred to me that if you were thinking about something that would hit the sweet spot of heightened outrage factors, it would be a COVID-19 vaccine. It includes genetic material in the case of the mRNA platforms. I don't really know what it is. There's complicated chemistry and science involved. I'm a little bit concerned that this is being forced on me against my will. And the outcomes that I'm worried about are pretty memorable. Concerns about infertility, concerns about death, other outcomes, concerns that I might actually get COVID from this. And so the point I'm trying to make is when we think about what Sandman tells us about risk perception, we are going to perceive COVID vaccines in a heightened way, a very emotional, subjective way, in the same way that we worry about shark attacks, right? When you go to the beach, and if you heard that there was a shark attack in Australia the week before, I don't know about you, but when I'm swimming in the water, I tell you, I'll be worried about a shark attack, okay? That's just how we perceive risk. So I hope that by thinking about the history and thinking about what Sandman tells us, that will give us some sensitivity to think about vaccine hesitancy, perhaps in a different light. Next slide, please. So a few things flow from this. Simply providing data is ineffective. I've been in meetings with very high-level people, and we raised the issue of vaccine hesitancy, and the response was, well, just give them the data. Just give them the results of the studies. I hope you will understand that that doesn't work for the reasons that we've already outlined. In other words, Sandman gives the example, suppose you and your partner want to go out, this is in the non-COVID era, but you want to go out and eat in a restaurant. And you know what? You get into a bit of a heated discussion. It gets a little bit out of hand. Emotions are raised, as they are with vaccines. And you're in a dispute with your partner about whether it's going to be Italian or Chinese that night. He said, do you really think your evening is going to go better if you research and provide relative data on the nutritional benefits of one type of food versus the other? I think you realize, if you've ever been in a relationship, that that's not going to work. So simply providing data is not an effective approach to addressing vaccine hesitancy. You really have to first understand and address these outrage factors. Next slide. And so I think when we look at the specific things that people are worried about with the COVID vaccine, this is a study that came out from the Kaiser Family Foundation in December. And what I want to focus on is the leftward column, the most far to the left column. This is what people are worried about when it comes to these vaccines. Above all, they're worried about side effects. I'm always careful in my communication. I actually think we're overusing the word side effects. I've been lucky enough to have both doses. After the second dose, I felt really tired and a bit chilled. And my reaction to that was, hooray, wonderful, the vaccine is working. So those flu-like symptoms, the low-grade fever, the myalgias, which I also got after the new shingles vaccine. And you know what? My reaction to that was, hooray, this is great. It's not a side effect. It's the primary effect of the vaccine. Why would we call that a side effect? That is reassurance to you that your immune system is now recognizing that spike protein, and should it ever come along subsequently on the wall of that virus, your immune system's memory is ready to go and to protect you. So I always think in our messaging, we shouldn't talk about those general immune signs and symptoms as side effects. That's exactly the vaccine doing what it should do. Look at these other issues. Do not trust the government. The vaccine is too new, which is something relatively specific for that. And it was rushed. Political concerns. I don't trust vaccines in general. I don't trust the health system. And so a lot of these are trust issues. So next slide. So I think who communicates is critical. When you're dealing with trust issues, they really cannot be addressed if the messenger is not perceived as a person of trust. Next slide. And who do people overwhelmingly trust for information on the COVID vaccine? That same study showed by far, it's not even close, it's their own doctor or healthcare provider. And I think that is, to bring it back to the West Virginia experience, I think this played a major role in our early success. It was not just a matter of the scale and the logistics, but by putting the vaccine in the hands of the community-based pharmacists. They are people in the community, known to members of the community. And so when people hesitated over the vaccine, those concerns could be much more effectively addressed by somebody that they knew and trusted. So as we move forward, we cannot lose sight of that. There's a lot of concern that as we ramp up the efforts, that we will exclude you. And people on this echo, you are the ones that are going to make sure that we have a continued successful vaccine administration. And I sure hope as we move forward that we continue to give you the resources and the vaccine that you need, because I firmly believe that you are best positioned to communicate effectively to your patients and overcome any concerns they may have. Next slide. Now, of course, I've been just using the word vaccine hesitancy, but I want to be clear that vaccine hesitancy is not a monolith. People vary in their level of concerns about vaccines, and this is just taken from a BMJ article from 2019. And you can see at the far left end, there are fixed anti-vaccine individuals. As Hans Rosling, the late Hans Rosling says, in talking to these people, you will often not get very far. And he gives the example of speaking with such people and saying, is there any evidence, is there any trial, is there any study that I could present to you that would change your mind about vaccines? And he indicated that in his experience, the answer to that was no. The response was, there is nothing you could ever tell me. There's no evidence that you could ever give me. There's no trial that would ever change my mind about my opposition to vaccines. And Hans Rosling points out, well, then, therefore, it is not an evidence-based position. If it is not amenable to be changed by evidence, it's not an evidence-based position. As my Irish father would say, with such individuals, save your breath to cool your porridge. You will not change their mind, and so there's just no way that they're going to change their opinion. So what we're really talking about is that group in the middle, and by the way, to the other end is where I put myself. I am a fixed pro-vaccine person, strongly supportive, and this leads to some important information about how we should be delivering the vaccines. I do not mean to suggest that the community-based approach is an exclusive approach. I think it's very important. I think it's probably the single most important, but it's also perfectly fine to have these vaccine super centers that you see to the right. If a person is a fixed pro-vaccine person, as I am, I would be perfectly comfortable driving up to such a center and getting the vaccine from a complete stranger. I actually did get the vaccine from a complete stranger, and I'm fine with that. That's not a problem for me. But probably more people are going to want what is shown to the left, that is a community-based pharmacy in West Virginia that was featured in some recent press. The people who are vaccine hesitant are going to be far more likely to receive the vaccine in the community context from someone that they know and trust that can address their questions and concern. What we're seeing in some countries like the UK that are further ahead of us, that have both models, that people are greatly preferring to get their vaccine from their general practitioners. There's also a logistical component to this. You know, I have a dog. My dog only, we do a far better job about vaccinating our dog than we do our humans in our population. So my dog has only ever gotten his vaccines from our vet, nowhere else. The vet's office will email us reminders when a vaccine is about to expire, so we know to take him in to get vaccines up to date. Myself, as a human, I have gotten vaccines through my employer, through my physician, through a travel clinic, because I travel a lot. And unless I emailed my doctor's office and said, please enter in my COVID vaccine, please enter in my flu vaccine, there would be no one repository for all of my vaccines. So there's very compelling reasons why we should want the primary care physicians to be providing these vaccines, to have a coordinated approach to all of your vaccines. Next slide, please. So, you know, this question, why do we vaccinate? You may be saying, well, that's a pretty stupid question. I'm known for my stupid questions. But let's look at this a little bit more deeply. One reason that we give vaccines is to prevent an individual from developing that disease. Consider the example of tetanus. As you know, tetanus is caused by a bacteria found in soil. We can never eradicate tetanus, it's all around. When you get your tetanus and your boosters thereafter throughout your adult life, the reason, and really the only reason to get that, is to prevent you as the recipient of the vaccine from developing tetanus. That is a vaccine solely about the development of disease in the person who's immunized. On the other hand, there's another dimension to this, and that is what interests me as a population health person, which is vaccinating to prevent transmission of disease within a population. As an example there, we continue to immunize every child against diphtheria. And I hesitate when we have people like Dr. Sarwari on the webinar, but usually when I talk to the clinicians, the pediatricians, et cetera, they tell me they have not seen a case of diphtheria at any point recently. And the reason that is because we have achieved such a high level of herd immunity that this agent simply cannot circulate in our population. So that would be an example of a vaccine that you really don't give to prevent that individual from developing the disease, given how uncommon it is in our population, but rather we do that entirely to maintain herd immunity to prevent transmission should a case be introduced into our population. So we have to keep those clear in our mind, because a lot flows when we think about this in terms of the COVID vaccine. Next slide. So this is the phases of the vaccination for our state. We are now, and I don't know if Dr. Costello's on the call, she can always correct me. I believe we are just entering phase 2A of this program timeline. But you can notice here when we compare phase 1 versus phase 2, you can think about this as moving relatively more towards attempts to limit the transmission. That becomes relatively more important as we move down the phases. Of course, you will continue to prevent disease in the individual, but the transmission component becomes more and more relevant as we proceed down the phases and start to immunize the general population. And I've been thinking a lot about where this is all going to end. What is our end game for COVID-19? Could we eradicate it, for example? Those are all interesting discussions to have. But when people ask you, when is life going to get back to normal? That's really about the transmission component of why we vaccinate. Next slide, please. And there's a lot to be very happy about. We have had steep declines in cases recently. They peaked in the first half of January, and they're coming down with some concerning plateauing that we've noticed in the most recent data. But there's been great news. The people that you're talking to are probably, how do I get the vaccine? That's what most people are saying to me. What can I do? I've registered, I haven't been contacted yet. You've seen the media with long lines of people lining up to get vaccines. And I want to introduce not just a note of caution, but perhaps stronger than that. We should not get a false sense of what this tells us about the population. I strongly believe that in the months ahead, as the doses of vaccine become more and more widely available, that's when we're going to begin to see the impact of widespread vaccine hesitancy. West Virginia is no more or no less vaccine hesitant than any other state. In fact, it's a little bit more, since studies show that rural populations tend to be more vaccine hesitant than urban populations. I think our early experience has given us a false sense of security because the rate limiting step has been dose availability. In other words, for every vaccine hesitant person who's a little bit unsure or staunchly opposed, there are many other people who will say, I will gladly take that dose. This is why this session, I think, is particularly important, because if we are not on top of our messaging to address vaccine hesitancy, I fear a situation where there are doses on shelves expiring because nobody is willing to have them put in their arm. A couple of more specific messages about that. With the Johnson & Johnson vaccine being authorized recently, you're hearing a lot of, as I am, well, that's a second-rate vaccine. It's 66% efficacious, whereas the others are 94 and 95. I want, I want the BMW of vaccines. I do not want a Subaru. Well, maybe I drive a Subaru. Nothing against Subarus, but there's this idea that this is an inferior vaccine. A couple of points that might be helpful as you're speaking to your patients. First of all, it's a single dose vaccine, and I think that has a convenience factor. You can also quite fairly say to your patients, listen, you'll be immune faster from this one dose than the 2-dose regimens. The Moderna would take 6 weeks from the first dose for you to achieve full immunity. And of course, we get hung up on this measure of efficacy. The reality is we don't really know how they compare, because these studies were done in different populations throughout the world and at different times. So we know for sure that we did not have the issue with variants when the phase 3 studies were done for Moderna and Pfizer, as we do currently, and when the Johnson & Johnson study was tested. In other words, if those mRNA vaccines were subjected to similar clinical trials, we don't know if the efficacy would still be 95%. I hope it would, but there are certainly reason to believe it would be lower. Secondly, as we look at more and more serious outcomes, the protection afforded by the Johnson & Johnson vaccine improves such that nobody in the vaccine arm of those studies died of COVID, which is the most serious outcome. So what your outcome is very much determines your success. And finally, it's a great vaccine. I think the problem that we have is the bar was set really high with these first 2 vaccines. So there's an anchoring effect here. We've become accustomed to 95% as the number. And the reality is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, if that had been the first one on the scene, we'd be very happy about a very effective vaccine. We wouldn't be nearly as worried about it as we are relative to those others. And we can, in terms of interrupting transmission, it can certainly play a role. Related to that, next slide, please. So I have an 11-year-old daughter. She doesn't read this book anymore, but if you ever have a daughter, I highly recommend, a young daughter, the Pinkalicious books. Our collective goal is to get as many of these 3 vaccines. More will be coming down the pipe. Of course, they have different efficacy, but they're all highly, highly effective. We want to get as many of them into as many arms as quickly as possible. Everything we know indicates that transmission will be reduced and a return to normalcy expedited if we have that as our collective goal. And as Pinkalicious said, next slide, please. It's hard to read that, but at the bottom, Pinkalicious's mother actually is saying to her when she's upset that she only got 1 chocolate cupcake, her mother says to her, you get what you get and you don't get upset. And that has to be our approach to COVID vaccines, that we should be recommending the vaccine that is available to you today is the one that we recommend for the important role it will play in transmission and protection of disease. Next slide, please. Finally, we've been talking about vaccines, but I don't want to lose sight that we have other mechanisms. And as when Clay Marsh gives talks, he always points out, we've got something as protective of a vaccine. It's called a mask. And Sir Ronald Ross, a medical officer who worked out the root of the cycle of malaria, says it will never be possible for any general community to adopt or enforce any one of these measures completely. All the measures are good and useful, and that each is most suitable under certain circumstances. These truths still continue to apply if we adopt not one single measure, but several combined. So vaccines, ongoing mask use, social distancing, hand washing, we still need to do all of those, and they will build upon each other in our goal of return to normalcy. Next slide. And let's not forget what a beautiful state we live in. I'm probably one of the few people that's upset to see the snow gone. This is 2 weeks ago at Whitegrass in the Dolly Sods skiing. So with that, I will see if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. We truly appreciate you taking the time to present that. And I really love the personal photos, the photo of your daughter with the Pinkalicious book and the snow photo, very beautiful. I did want to say Dr. Rexford earlier in the chat had said she's a history major, and so I'm sure she appreciates that little dose of history in your PowerPoint. I also did want to, before we jump into a Q&A portion, kind of bring everyone's attention over to the chat. Stephanie had also mentioned saying that we should maybe be careful communicating to people that symptoms indicate a vaccine is working. We may actually inject doubt to those experiencing no symptoms following the vaccination. So I didn't know, Dr. Martin, if you wanted to comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a very practical comment, that we don't want to give the false impression that if you don't get action, the vaccine has worked. At that point, completely agree. Highly, one of the things that I don't think I said well is that we really need to tailor our messaging. That individual communication, I think it was implicit in what I said, but let me be explicit, that individual messaging and understanding where your patient, why they're concerned, what they're concerned about, targeted communication is critical, and that would be something to address in that. So someone calls you up in the clinic and say, I'm really worried, I feel awful. That would be helpful to that individual, but you certainly wouldn't want those that didn't experience that not to experience. And we know that as you get older, your immune systems are not as robust, and you'd be less likely to experience that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin. So we got 2 questions in the chat. So if there are no other comments from, I see some other Hub members on too, Dr. Sarwari, I think Dr. Moffat, Dr. Weiss, it's great to see you as well. And I think Dr. Gupta as well. If any of you folks had some comments you wanted to make as well, just before we jump into the Q&A portion, feel free to do so as well by unmuting or chatting in.
They can comment, but they're not allowed to ask me questions. I get nervous.
It sounds good to me.
The mistakes I made, just email me privately.
Alrighty, so I'll just ask the first
Chris,
question
you
then.
never make
So
a
we got one
mistake.
asking. I agree with that, Dr. Moffat, thank you. All right, so the first question we got in was asking, do you feel that more individuals are nervous about the COVID vaccine due to not knowing what the long-term impacts might be versus the other vaccines?
An excellent question. When you look at the history of vaccines, that question has been raised every time we've had a new vaccine. I can let my infectious disease colleagues chime in, but you always hear that. Now, of course, that's going to be heightened with the COVID vaccine, because again, people perceive it to be rushed, and it was rushed in some ways. But I always point out to people that these phase 3 studies for the COVID vaccines, in terms of their epidemiologic design, were no different than those used for any other vaccine in terms of sample size, duration of follow-up, et cetera. We rarely see adverse outcomes beyond the follow-up of those studies. It's not unheard of, but it's most uncommon. So what we worry about with vaccines usually declares itself within the follow-up of the studies that were performed for these vaccines.
Thank you very much.
I'll just add something on to what Chris just said. So I get questions from people who have questions about their family members, right? And they're talking about like, well, what about Guillain-Barré? And what about this? And what about that? And I think in the immediate, the first part of the vaccination effort, I think those were reasonable things to be concerned about. If somebody had, there's a family member that had Guillain-Barré, blah, blah, blah. But we've now given, what, 20 million vaccines, 25 million vaccines, 30, 40, 50 million vaccines. and at least 25 million have had several months now of experience, and we have not seen those, which usually are seen in the first couple of months. And so I think that the farther we get out with our experience, the more we're going to be able to reassure people about some of these other very low likelihood but scary events.
And again, you know, that's a problem of epidemiology. That's a sample size issue, as I would see it. And you know, in a trial of 40,000 people followed for months, you're just not going to be able to detect very, very uncommon adverse effects. And I think you know, we need to be very transparent about that. I hear a lot about transparency, but the problem is when you ask people what transparency means, it means talk openly about the good things. Don't say anything about the negative things. And Peter Sandman points out that we've really kind of, as a public health profession, to some extent failed because we worry, and I've seen this in my work with the state, like, do we talk about the infertility issue? Do we put that in the FAQ? Because if we put that in the FAQ, are people going to say, whoa, you know, is it going to heighten concern? You know, Sandman points out some things, because the difficulty with that is in this day and age, people are going to find out the negative. When people are concerned about vaccines, it's not that they are uninformed. It's not that they aren't aware of information. They're consuming large amounts of information. Some of it is misinformation. But I've started sessions before with statements like, and unfortunately, Kathy Moffat was on the call, so she messed up my exercise because they heard her response. But I started off a session once with the statement, the federal government compensates people for adverse events from vaccines. When Kathy Moffat was not there, the overwhelming response I got from primary care providers was false, 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 false. That's misinformation. That's a true statement. That program does exist. I have a resident who works there. Or other statements like more people are dying of polio derived from the vaccine than the wild virus. That's also a true statement. So I think Sandman kind of criticizes us more broadly for saying we're going to be transparent, but that really only means the positive stuff. And what he has criticized us for is that people find this out through other channels that we don't want them to be their sources of information, and it confuses them. I see Lee Petzonk there, and Lee, I apologize. I messed up your chat because I direct messaged you. So your messages are only going to me. I messaged him and said, don't ask me any hard questions. But he needs to convey his CME information if he wants to. And he asks the question, you highlight the role of trust in reducing outrage. Can you comment on the role of medical institutions in assuring that the message is coherent? I.e. all docs who see patients should have completed vaccine. No faculty should actively discourage vaccine use. So that's a hypothetical, is it, Lee? Anyway, absolutely. Go ahead. You want to?
No, I was just going to give you my chuckle on that.
Yeah, this is the difficulty. And again, we would love to have consistent, clear communication. We also know that seeing people, key figures get the vaccine themselves goes a very long way to establishing trust and overcoming hesitancy. Again, I would, Lee, you've raised critical points. Operationalizing them is the challenge. People are seeing different sources of information. Again, I think it speaks to the need to your provider being the one that is empowered to give you that information and have those discussions with you. That's who you're going to trust more than anybody else.
You know, there is a billboard at the Star City Bridge that echoes some of the inaccurate vaccine information. And is there, I guess, if a practicing physician encourages the use of treatments or prescribes treatments that are not medically indicated or supported, we can take action against that person. But if they advocate for something that we know is not public health valid, what do? Just sit on our hands? That's my question.
Pass. No, it's an excellent question. I do think when you look at what comes from those sources, some of it is the information that I mentioned. Information taken totally out of context. In some cases, true statements, like the federal government does compensate. That's something that I've seen a lot. Also, the variable efficacy of the flu vaccine. But when you explain to people, so I think one way to respond to that is that we say those things. They're not hearing it from those sources. They're hearing it from us. That yes, there is a federal program. And I worked as a consultant for that federal program in the past. When you explain to them that this arose out of legislation because the pharmaceutical companies were making no money off the primary series of vaccines and were going to stop making things like measles vaccines. They were going to stop all of that. And Congress intervened and to protect them. And that program does not think that these adverse effects have been proven scientifically. It's to keep it out of court and to preserve our supply to the primary series of vaccines and the seasonal flu. When someone in a position of trust says that, that can kind of mitigate it. I think Sandman is onto something when he says we are so reluctant to say anything negative that they see these billboards, they go to these websites, and they check and they find out that some of this is true. It really kind of confuses and undermines trust in us, which is where they should be getting their information from.
Thanks.
Thank you all very much. And thank you, Lee, for the great comment and question as well. So the next question we got in was asking, so there is a West Virginia bill, HB 2869, introduced to limit the requirement of masks, shields, and coverings. How do we address this ongoing issue?
I would come back to my quote on that Dr. Ross. We need all of the tools right now. And, you know, I actually listened to Rochelle Walensky being asked the same question given what's happened in Texas. So with full attribution to her, I think it was Ari asked her on NPR, you know, but everyone's exhausted, you know. I am exhausted. I don't enjoy giving this in a patient exam room and telling my staff I'm down here. You know, I haven't been able to see my mother. It's been miserable. What she said, which I think is a really important point, you know, I'm going to embellish it a little bit. I'm going to have the hubris to embellish what the CDC director says, but nonetheless, it's, you know, the way I think about it is this is a marathon, right? And after you have run this far, when the finish line is in sight, you can see it, you know, we're looking at that downward sloping curve. Why on earth would you pull back? You know, we need everything we know about disease control is that we need every single measure at our disposal. So I oppose that. Yes, I'm as fed up as everybody else is. We need, you know, the history of eradication and control of infectious disease means use every tool available to the maximum extent possible. It really is that simple. And just because you start vaccinating, you don't stop washing your hands and you don't stop social distancing and you don't throw the masks away.
Thank you very much. Did anyone else want to comment on that as well? All right, we don't have any other, oh, Lee, was there a comment you wanted to make or question?
No, I think that Chris stated it well, but you know, just because your feet hurt, don't take your sneakers off when you can see the finish line. It's that simple. Yeah.
And unfortunately, you know, this is what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle pointed out as the paradox, one of the reasons of vaccine hesitancy all along. It's precisely when the vaccines start to work that people trust them less. So when you look at the surveys of, you know, how many people are reluctant to get a COVID vaccine, it goes up and down depending upon how bad the pandemic is. And that's why I made that point. Our problem is ahead of us. This is going to be an increasing problem. And if we don't get this right from the beginning, we're in big trouble collectively because of the transmission component. And the variants, right? We didn't talk about the variants, but when the virus is circulating more freely in the population, every time it enters a cell and hijacks the machinery, that's an opportunity for a variant.
Thank you. And I see Jennifer Boyd also chatted in, great point. How to address the HB 2869 is to call legislators and educate. Very great point. Thank you, Jennifer.
Great point. Yeah, indeed.
So no other, oh, Dr. Sarwari?
Oh, no. Oh, I thought I was okay.
Dr. Martin, stellar, as always, as always. We always learn from you, and thank you very, very much. I think you're a master communicator and wish everybody could listen to you speak. One of the questions and concerns really comes down to vaccine hesitancy in a very new era. Is there literature on the impact of social media and how this hesitancy has changed with the platforms of communication changing?
As expected, a very thoughtful and probing question from you, and I thought I was going to escape unscathed. And thank you for your kind comments. I am not aware of anything specific to vaccine hesitancy, but we know from other studies that misinformation spreads far more rapidly and widely than true information. So assuming the same holds about vaccines, I think certainly those tools that you've mentioned, while vaccine hesitancy itself is not new, these new technologies are going to allow information and misinformation to spread very, very rapidly and have a big, big impact. And again, I think coming back to the point that I've made, when people, it's not as if, the idea that that vaccine hesitancy is because people don't know information is false. The measles outbreak in Orange County illustrates that. These were very high socioeconomic status, very high levels of education. They knew a lot of information. They just gotten it from unreputable sources. And all of those tools that you describe are tools that can enhance that dramatically and make it much faster.
Thank you very much, everyone. Any other comments or thoughts anyone wanted to share? We do have the brief poll at the end, but I would hate to cut the session short if we didn't have to. All righty. I see Jen clapping. Absolutely. Big round of applause. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for another great didactic. Truly appreciate it, and handling all the Q&A and stuff as well. So we truly appreciate you. So the only announcement that I do have is that our next session will be on March 18th, and Dr. Gupta will be discussing Project Frontline. So keep an eye out for that reminder as always. And we are going to launch the poll now, and anytime you guys finish the poll, just feel free to log off and we'll see you guys next time. Thank you. Is everyone able to see the poll okay?
Yep, I can see it. I get to rate myself. I can skew the results. Great to see everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.